Some kids go to summer camp and learn archery or swimming. Bart Ehrman learned about something else there. Eternal damnation.
Like 8 or 9 at summer camp, and there was a pastor there kind of trying to explain how it all worked. And I started thinking, wow, that's serious. I think most people don't like the idea of being tortured for eternity.
The pastor wasn't trying to overly scare Bart and the other kids. For Christians, hell was just part of the landscape.
When you grow up in a Christian culture, even if you're not a Christian, it's just kind of the natural assumption. Your soul goes to one place or the other. And sometimes it can be very good, and a lot of times it's not good at all. I started thinking there really is a hell, and people are going to go there if they don't ask Jesus into their heart.
From Christianity to Islam to Zoroastrianism, the notion that punishment and torture await evildoers is common in many faiths. In fact, more than half of Americans believe in a literal hell.
Do you believe in hell? Yes.
I do believe in hell in its own way.
I do believe in hell.
I do believe in hell, and I would describe it as lots of bad people there.
I'm not sure if I believe in hell, but I kind of feel it exists.
It doesn't necessarily have to be fire. It could be your own personal hell, whatever is negative in your life.
It would be like your worst nightmare or your worst life's experience, kind of just reliving that over and over and over for eternity.
I do think about it often. I think about it every day. When I feel like I'm not making a good decision or doing a bad thing, I feel like that's going to be a strike against me, which is going to send me below.
You never know who goes there. But they just better get right with God. Because if they want to live eternal life, they get right with God.
Believing in hell can lead to fear and distress. But it also can be an effective tool to nudge people toward being good. And strange as it might seem, maybe even provide solace or a sense of justice. On this episode, we'll talk to University of North Carolina professor Bart Ehrman, author of the best-selling book Heaven and Hell, A History of the Afterlife, about how views of the bad place have changed over time, and how his own perspective on hell came to challenge his faith and worldview.
Was trying to reconcile what I was seeing as true versus what I used to think was true, and fearing that if I got it wrong, I was in trouble.
And we'll talk to Washington Post columnist and Islamic studies professor Shadi Hamid about the role hell plays in his spiritual life as a Muslim, and why he thinks it offers an important framework, not just for people's own lives, but for society as a whole.
Because if God is going to provide the ultimate reward or the ultimate punishment later on, then we can delay judgment and we can learn to live with the imperfections of this life.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works.
I guess how I see it portrayed to me on TV as a hot, fiery place, not a very comfortable place to be in.
I just visualize and hear screaming, like people screaming loud and forever.
I hear it's not even hot. It's actually supposed to be really, really cold down there.
Flowing rivers of lava and like ash, come to mind with people in them.
Really bad smell of meat, like rotten meat. I'll describe the smell as that in hell.
I believe sinners goes there, and I'm just telling you this from how I was told when I went to church when I was little.
It's where you go, repent for your soul, and, where demons stay.
It's the everlasting burning, forever and ever and ever. Ain't no coming out of it.
Whether it's from sacred texts, a preacher on the pulpit, a movie, or my favorite show, The Good Place, most people have an idea of what hell, the bad place,
I have written you
is.
a 3-hour spoken word jazz opera.
Okay, no. What? No. No version of heaven for anyone would ever include 3 hours of this. We're in the bad place.
This is the bad place. I fucking knew it. And clam chowder is disgusting. It's just hot ocean milk with dead animal croutons. This is the bad place.
The pig's getting angry.
This is the bad place.
And while we might not agree on the exact details, one thing's for sure, you don't want to end up there.
Early Christians not only believed this stuff, they preached it.
As a religion professor, Bart Ehrman has spent decades studying ideas about hell.
These accounts of the torments of hell became a missionary tool very early on. And there started arising a number of what we would call near-death experiences, where stories would be told of somebody who died and went to hell and came back and told the story. And preachers would use these accounts to terrify people. This was part of the Christian preaching, that if you didn't believe Jesus and accept his death and resurrection, that you would be eternally damned.
Hell was the ultimate scare tactic for driving people to a faith and keeping them in it. And as such, it's been an effective tool for Christians and several other faiths to bring people into the fold.
It's kind of like somebody who invents a new product that nobody knows they need, right? So you invent a vacuum cleaner. What is a vacuum? I don't need but then you show how it works. And then people, I want that. The marketing strategy is you create the need, and then you're the one who fulfills the need. And so that's what happens with hell. They convince people that this is real, and that's why they convert then.
As an adolescent, Bart was already a Christian. But as he thought more about the idea of hell, it made him want to try and convert people too.
Part of the reason for wanting to understand the Bible and know more about my faith and understand theology was because I was convinced that people who didn't accept this faith would go to hell. And I didn't want that to happen to people. And so I also became missionary at the same time I became scholarly.
While the terror of hell governed part of Bart's religious life, it was his curiosity about it, a desire to make sure he really knew what hell was all about, that motivated some of his scholarship. He attended a Bible college and then Princeton Theological Seminary, eventually becoming one of the nation's leading Bible scholars. But it was along that journey that he discovered some things that truly surprised him. For one, the way Christians now think about hell wasn't at all the way people thought of it at the time of Jesus.
The thing is, it wasn't really a teaching that you find in Judaism or in the Hebrew Bible. In most Jewish circles at the time, it was believed that you died and that was the end of the story. People like Jesus, who were what scholars today call apocalyptic Jews, they held to a view of the coming apocalypse. They thought what was going to happen was that at the end of time, it's not that your soul, would go to heaven or hell, but at the end of time, your body, yourself, would be raised from the dead, and those who were faithful would be given eternal life in their bodies, and those who are shown to be wicked and opposed to God would be shown the errors of their ways and then would be destroyed in fire, but they would be annihilated. They're not going to be tortured forever. So that was a common view in Jesus' day among people like him who were apocalypticists, but it wasn't their soul went one place to the other. The idea that your soul goes to one place or another comes out of Greek thought, not out of the Hebrew Bible. It goes back well before Plato.
The idea of an immortal soul crops up in one of the earliest pieces of literature in existence, the Epic of Gilgamesh from about 2100 BCE. Not to get too bogged down in ancient history here, but let's just say that Gilgamesh wasn't a fan of the view of death at his time.
There, basically, you die and you're kind of conscious down there like in the dirt, eating worms, being eaten by worms. And so it's like not pleasant. And the whole Gilgamesh epic is about Gilgamesh, this hero who wants to escape that because he realizes it's not good and he wants to find immortality. And so it's the quest for immortality.
Here, hell wasn't so much fire and brimstone as it was, well, just death. There is no punishment or reward, just a kind of non-existence you have to endure. But by the time we get to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, things change. The proto-hell goes from the realm of dirt and worms to an actual hell, a different place, below the dirt and worms.
There's this idea of Hades, this place where everybody kind of goes. They look like they do on Earth, but they're just shadows of who they were. And there's nothing to do down there. It's boring. People can't really think. They can't really speak. They just kind of exist as the shadows of themselves. And so it's not pleasant, but it's for everybody. The only exceptions are a few superstars like, Heracles, who goes up to heaven.
Wow. So the idea was that basically everybody was going to spend eternity bored and gloomy.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have this account in the Odyssey where in book 10, Odysseus goes down because he needs to meet with a prophet down there. And he sees all these very famous, powerful people, and they can't talk. They can't think. Achilles, the strongest man ever to have lived, who has no strength, zero strength, can't even shake hands. So it's like, oh my God, it's everybody. It doesn't matter if you're good or bad, righteous, unrighteous, whatever.
The ancient Greeks had a pretty egalitarian view of what comes after. Almost everyone, including mighty Achilles, will suffer to some extent. Only the gods enjoyed a happy immortality. But as you might imagine, this state of affairs raised an important question for the Greeks to deal with. If there's no reward after death, why be good on earth when being a bit bad could be more fun?
You're good on earth because this life is worth cherishing. And if you're good, you're more likely to live well. And the gods are not interested in punishing you after your death. They don't really have any control over the death situation, but they do control life now. And so if you're pleasing to the gods, you'll be rewarded and you'll have a better life and you won't go down as quickly. You can hold on to this life longer. And that's the idea. Just hang around as long as you can.
So how did that begin to change? How did we go from heaven can be here, that is, you can enjoy yourself if you live a good life, but you're all going to be bored and gloomy after, to thinking about eternal joy or eternal damnation?
The basic idea that's driving it is that if you are doing the right things, that you're going to live a good life and the gods will reward you or God will reward you. But pretty soon you start looking around and you realize that people who are real schmucks are having a pretty good time down here. And people who are just really trying to be good people are horribly suffering. And so that just doesn't seem right. I mean, if the gods are on your side or if God is on your side, then why is it like that? And so the answer is, well, it's that way now, but they're going to make it up to you later. And there really is justice in the world. And the gods will have their way, or God will have his way. And those who are sinful, mean, nasty people are going to pay for it. They're not going to get away with it. And people who really try to do what's good and try to please God or the gods will be rewarded. And so you get that in Plato, you get it in Jewish traditions, and so it starts developing over time.
Plato, and in his writings about Socrates, they often say, or they're famous for saying, philosophy is the art of dying. It's basically preparing yourself for that. So what were some of the new thoughts that they generated about justice, and how was that received at the time?
Plato has they're called the myths of Plato, where somebody dies and has like a near-death experience and realizes what it's like, where people who are righteous and just are given rewards and people who are unrighteous are penalized or tormented. And what he's trying to say, it appears, is that it is better to live a life that is just, even if it means suffering now, than to perpetrate injustice or to be unrighteous. That you should be lawful, you should be fair, you should be just, you should be honest, and that's a better life, even if you suffer for it. And the way he tries to emphasize this is by telling a myth about the afterlife. And then it starts erupting in places as a full-blown understanding of a heaven and a hell.
So we went from the Mesopotamian idea of being in the ground with worms to the Greek idea of Hades, where it was kind of just gloomy and boring. And depending on which scholars you read, the ancient Jewish idea of Sheol was one or the other of those two. A place similar to Hades, or literally the tomb. But this brings us back to the time of Jesus and the apocalyptic framework that was shaping it. Apocalyptic Jews taught a kind of horizontal dualism, a timeline in which there were two ages, the wretched present and the glorious future, which they believed was just around the corner. But as we know, that glorious age didn't come, and that caused a problem. One that required a reorientation of sorts.
What happens in Christianity is the timeline gets switched on its axis. The horizontal prediction doesn't work because the end doesn't come. And so you flip the axis, you still have dualisms of this and of that, but now hell is down there and heaven is up there. And so that's where you start getting heaven and hell.
But that idea of hell didn't remain static. Its perils and tortures got a lot of attention as Christianity continued to develop. One example is from the Apocalypse of Peter.
This Apocalypse of Peter is Peter being given a guided tour of the realms of the blessed and the damned by Jesus himself, where he sees the various kinds of punishments being doled out in hell, and he sees how glorious it is up in heaven. But when he starts describing the torments of hell, oh my God, he goes into such gory detail about who's being punished for what and how they're being punished and the torments that are going on down there. And so he's laying it out in lurid detail. I don't know if it's because it's more interesting or because it's possible to be more creative about pain than pleasure, but in either case, and that becomes the trend then, where there's a lot more interest in the hell than there is in heaven.
While this book, like many early texts, didn't make it into the final version of the New Testament, the images it evoked are still widespread. Over the centuries, Christianity and other faiths continued to focus on hell, even as Dante did, elaborating on its many supposed ghastly levels. They figured out something that science proved much later. The pointy stick of punishment for sins often looms larger than the gold star for good behavior. Or put another way, you can always count on fear and pain to hold people's attention. But attention doesn't always translate into action. So the real question is, does the fear of punishment actually make us behave better? And if so, is the threat of hellfire really a good way to encourage our better angels? Up next, we'll talk with someone who thinks it might be.
There are times when I think about taking a certain path in my life and the idea of hell registers with me. It's not just some hypothetical thing. It actually has changed my behavior at key moments.
Shadi Hamid is a professor of Islamic studies at Fuller Theological Seminary and a devout Muslim himself. And like its spiritual cousin Christianity, Islam also envisions a place of eternal torment for deserving souls, a realm called Jahannam. And while Shadi's belief in hell is faith-based, he acknowledges that the idea of an afterlife of eternal pain can also be a pretty effective cognitive tool.
It's actually not super easy to be as moral as we probably should be. We as human beings need incentives. We do respond to reward and punishment. Because in an ideal world, we would just be inclined towards wanting to be in communion with God or having all the wonderful pleasures of heaven. You know, that can take you far. But ultimately, if we're talking about on average throughout human history, most of us can benefit from having this additional encouragement, this additional incentive structure.
Shadi doesn't shy away from the idea that no one's perfect. We all could use a little help now and again. So maybe it's okay to rely on religion as a support, even a crutch to find your better angels. In fact, he thinks that's one of religion's main purposes. If you break your foot, no one would judge you for using literal crutches. So the same should go for our moral lives. If you accept that we're all susceptible to sin, then what's the harm in looking to religion for support? Prayer, scripture, and the like might just be tools God gives people of faith to help them along the way. And hell? That's just one more tool, with a little extra spice.
As human beings, we do respond to fear. This is just the way that we are. I'd be fine maybe not getting into heaven as long as there isn't something terrible on the other side of it. So there has to be that sense of fear.
Shadi's right. For better or worse, fear is a big motivator. Of all the negative emotions we feel, fear is the most arousing. It's the one that most gears us up and pushes us to act. But fearing punishment at the end of life, as opposed to something more immediate, like seeing a snake in your path, can seem a little abstract. Which is why hell, in Islam as in Christianity, invokes some pretty graphic imagery.
When you offer up images of hellfire, of burning, all of us can imagine the terror of our skin burning. And that focuses the mind and attention. I do think there is a really interesting theological debate about the images of burning and fire. How literally is that meant to be taken? Is God using those kinds of images to help us understand something that we would otherwise not understand? Because if he said something like, oh, well, if you're bad and commit sins, then you'll be deprived of eternal communion in God's presence or something like that. But my sense is that if that was the message, a lot of people would be like, oh, is that really all that's at stake? Look, that would be nice to be in communion with God. But you know what? I'd kind of be fine without it.
On this point, science backs Shadi up. For example, while experiments show that people's general level of religiosity doesn't predict whether they'll cheat on something, their specific belief that God will punish them does. Several studies show that the more people believe God might send them to hell for bad behavior, the less they cheat on tests, even when they think no one will know. And those lab studies are backed up by some real-world statistics too. Societies where greater proportions of people believe in hell tend to have lower crime rates, even when you take things like poverty and population density into account. There's even some historical precedent here. As we noted once before on this show, the psychologist Aranorn Zion and colleagues have shown that the idea of an omniscient, moralistic God, one who knows when you've sinned, tends to develop right around the same time societies are becoming complex enough for people to cheat without getting caught. If you live in a small village, it's hard to misbehave without anyone knowing and punishing you. But if you're a tax collector counting money for the king, or a scribe in the temple recording gifts and debts, a little self-dealing or cooking the books is easy enough to hide from other people, but not from an all-knowing God. And if that God can send you to a place of torment when you die, well, let's just say that might be enough to give you pause, and with it, help keep society functioning in a more honest way. But again, does God really have to be so mean? Hell so relentlessly brutal to work? Like 10 on a scale of 10?
The idea of punishment is unfashionable, and I think we bristle at the idea that, oh, would God really do that? He would really, punish people? That seems harsh. I know it's kind of outdated and somewhat archaic to really emphasize the role of fear, and people will often say that we shouldn't be motivated primarily by fear, and I agree with that. That maybe shouldn't be the primary impetus, but I think we're just also generally uncomfortable with the idea of harsh punishment.
That concern has led to the rise of a more modern view of God as all-loving, all-caring. In other words, God's easygoing. But Shadi argues that ultimately, whether or not you believe God to be more or less benevolent, it doesn't change the fact that you're accountable for your actions. So while the God of Islam or Christianity might not be self-interested like the Greek gods of old, that doesn't mean anything goes.
God is the most merciful, but to be the most merciful doesn't necessarily negate that certain punishments are deserved. I think the question of whether something is deserved and warranted is very important. Now, you might be someone who believes that nothing warrants hell, but if you are a dictator who has killed or oppressed, hundreds of thousands or millions of people, then why does God's love negate the fact that you should be punished for those sins and for those crimes? It's not really a binary in that sense.
You've written that the idea of hell, in some sense, allows us not to worry so much about trying to punish evildoers here. And I can see some benefit in that. But isn't there also a danger that if we start to think we know which sins qualify someone for hell, that we might try to take some power in our own hands.
Look, there's always a risk that people will take something and go too far with it. There's no way to get around that. But I think what we can see is that without a concept of God or religion or hell, you run the risk of creating hell on earth. This is the thing. I mean, we look at the 20th century, and that to me is the lesson of the 20th century, that when you have the rise of secular ideologies, and here I'm talking primarily about communism and fascism, this idea that if only we got rid of religion, then people would be nice and they wouldn't overstep their bounds and they wouldn't go too far. It's nonsense. We know that without religion, people will still seek punishment, and I would argue more brutal punishments. Because if you don't have the promise of paradise in the next life, then you almost have this sense of urgency that it has to be done in the here and now. If there is nothing left after this, then we better get it right now. I think what religion can offer in a sense of the next life is an opportunity to chill. Because if God is going to provide the ultimate justice, the ultimate reward, or the ultimate punishment later on, then we can delay judgment, we can suspend judgment, and we can learn to live with the imperfections of this life without feeling that same intensity. Now, I totally grant that a lot of religious people do not listen to what I just said. They are not.
Yes.
They are not chilling. Okay. Yeah, I get it.
It might sound strange, but while many people have been stressed over the political situation in the U.S. and around the world, Shadi has managed to maintain a sense of calm. How does he do this? Well, counterintuitively, despite being something of a political pundit himself, he puts less faith in politics.
I'm not going to invest so much meaning in politics because I know that it's temporal, it's not everything, and that justice will have to come at some later point. We have to learn to live with some degree of injustice because we will never eliminate it. We know that imperfection is our lot in this world. I wish that things were better. I wish that American politics was better. I wish that the Middle East wasn't as oppressive as it currently is. I would love to see before I die the spread of democracy in the Arab world. But you know what? There's a good chance I'm not going to see those things. And I have to come to terms with that as an individual. And I have to reorder my life accordingly. I'm going to do the best I can as a writer, as a speaker, to try to convey the things that are dear to me and to try to influence policymakers and to make change and all of that. But I'm just one person ultimately. I do the best that I can, and then I leave it up to God. And that's, I think, a very important phrase here. We do what we can, but we have to let go because it's outside of our control.
Leaving it up to God might sound strange, but for people of faith, it can be a pretty healthy strategy. For people who don't believe, having a sense of control in life is kind of like Goldilocks. You need to get the balance just right. Too little, and you feel helpless. Too much, and you feel responsible for everything. And either of those poles takes a toll on your mental health. But for those who give control over to God, that pattern disappears, along with the stress it can cause. But don't call that letting go complacency. Shadi says trusting in God doesn't necessarily mean becoming passive in the face of problems. It doesn't mean giving up on working for a better world. But it does mean recognizing that you or your peers aren't failures if you can't fix everything right now. You don't have to provide ultimate justice for the horrendous suffering we're seeing in places around the world at the hands of political leaders.
I think so many of us feel this sense of powerlessness, and it probably won't get better anytime soon. And we're going to have to live with that knowledge. And so, yes, I think on both counts, hell and heaven, it does allow us a certain coming to terms with what we have to come to terms with.
Who decides which sins? Sins of commission, sins of omission, which ones are worthy of hell?
I guess the short answer is God. There's, a long-standing, Islamic tradition that when scholars would give fatwas or religious edicts, they would offer very strong opinions in the body of the text, but then they would always end with the words, and only God knows best. Because they're reminding themselves at the very end that they are human beings and there has to be a kind of intellectual humility.
So is it fair to say then, from your view, that at a societal level, the idea of hell in some ways is more of a balm than a cudgel to beat us with for guilt and fear?
Yes, it's a balm, but it's also a reminder and it's also a warning. Because sometimes I think to myself, how do these people sleep at night? Do they really think that they can get away with murder? How are they able to face God? Do they have no fear of what's to come? These are all warnings, but they're warnings for each and every one of us. They're things for us to reflect on day in and day out. For people who have power, it's magnified.
Where does intent matter? That if I do it because I don't really want to do it, but I'm afraid I'll be punished if I don't. Does that matter?
I don't think it matters as much as people might want it to matter. Yes, like intuitively, we would want people to just do things for the good, out of the goodness of their heart. But what does that even mean, the goodness of their heart? Because a lot of people do good because it makes them feel good. Let's not pretend that there is some way to separate our own benefit from what we do. So I think it's just different gradations of it. And again, religion is meant for the masses. It's meant to address people at every stage of their lives, the average median voter, if you will. And some people aren't always doing something out of the goodness of their heart is not going to be enough. So you need to kind of give them something more. Moral behavior because of reward and punishment because of heaven and hell. It's maybe not ideal, but sometimes it's all we have.
Pursuing virtue is hard, and a lot of research shows our minds are pretty good at finding reasons to justify, or should I say rationalize, our bad behavior. So the idea of hell can serve as an important counterweight, something that, if you're a believer, you can't easily ignore. For Bart Ehrman, after spending the first part of his life practicing, evangelizing, and studying the Christian faith, he found himself deeply struggling with this question.
But my big fear was that if I no longer believed in God and there were no more rewards and punishments after death, that I'd have no moral compass anymore. Like, how would I know what was right and wrong? And why not just, live for myself and forget anyone else? Or why not just have an orgy every night? I mean, why not? Hey, let's party. And so that was a very serious consideration of mine. And I really was afraid I'd become a nihilist and an anarchist and just a wild living person. I didn't want to be, really. And I was completely surprised when I deconverted that it didn't happen that way at all.
Abandoning the idea of the afterlife didn't make Bart a hedonist. Without the possibility of heaven or hell, he found a deeper motivation to do good, alleviate suffering, and follow a moral path to make the most of his one life on earth.
I realized this life is all there is. And since this is all there is, we need to cherish it for all it can give us. And so I have a greater zest for life now than I ever did before. I have more joy and happiness in life than I ever did before. I have more peace of mind than I ever had before. I realized that everybody else is in the same boat. And so this idea that somebody's suffering now, so it'll be okay because God will make up for it, that's just nonsense in my mind now. And so what I think is that if people are suffering now, as being a human being myself, I need to help them. And so it's made me more charitable toward other people, realizing that this is all they've got too. And it's not going to be made up for them later. And so I just think part of being human is helping those in need. And that has increased in me.
It's pretty clear that you don't need religion to be good. But it's also just as clear that it can help. And given the human mind's tendency to focus on the negative, the idea of hell can be a pretty compelling force for good. Does that mean you should believe in it? That's not for me to say. What I can say is that whether or not hell is real, believing in it has consequences. There's the fear and anxiety it creates, neither of which is good for you if it becomes chronic. But we do have negative emotions for a reason. In small doses, say at times when you're debating a morally dicey course of action, such emotions might be useful. I think it boils down to how carefully people cultivate their character. If they deeply ponder the view that this life, this existence, might be the only one they get, like Bart, it can lead to taking each day seriously, to want to make a difference that will be part of a legacy. Of course, as Shadi cautions, that might cause stress too, by forcing us to try and fix everything right now. And then there's also, to borrow Shadi's term, the fact that many people live their days more like the average voter, meaning a little less engaged in life's deeper questions and consequences. There, having a quick tool at hand to counteract temptation can be a help. Does this mean that believing in hell is a good thing, for us as individuals or for society as a whole? Until and unless we have scientific proof of hell, the answer is, it all depends. Do you favor the carrot or the stick? Next time on How God Works, December is almost upon us. And that means for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, we're entering the darkest, coldest days of the year. A time when, maybe more than ever, we could use a little joy and hope. So while we're hard at work on a special holiday episode to help brighten your holidays, we wanted to share one of our favorite episodes from the archives, to bring some light and wisdom into these dark days.
If even people who suffered just the worst possible losses you can imagine, if they are willing to try to find the humanity on the other side, then maybe there's hope for the rest of us.
We'll talk with New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, who, while having covered some of the greatest pain and tragedies, still finds hope in the act of journalism and the world he covers.
I think it's because of some notion that we can make a difference, that we can have an impact on the world around us.
And we'll talk with Roshi Joan Halifax, ecologist, civil rights activist, and founder of the Upaya Zen Center, about the Buddhist notion of wise hope and the fierce compassion it can unleash.
Hope is not a story that is based on optimism that everything's going to be okay. Wise hope really rests in the experience of openness, of not knowing, of not being attached to outcome.
How we too, through compassion for ourselves and others, can find a deep, wise hope. How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Josie Holtzman and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks.org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at HowGodWorksPod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.